Welcome back. This video will introduce fundamental concepts relevant to multimedia development. And let's start with a quick overview. We'll begin with the big ideas first, starting with the various learning contexts in which we teach and how multimedia learning objects are utilized in those particular contexts. We'll then review a popular knowledge framework for instructional technology that's called TPACK. And of course, all multimedia developers need a solid foundation in instructional design, so we'll review a couple of models worth remembering. Then we'll take a look at the big questions that multimedia researchers have targeted both historically and recently, and we'll introduce some of the evidence-based practices that they think we as developers should follow. And finally, we'll survey a sampling of some of the tools and terminology that pervade this discipline. Let's talk about where we teach first. Seriously, we are a varied bunch of professionals and we teach in a wide variety of different settings. We're public school teachers, we're coaches, we're software developers, we're law enforcement agents, we're higher education faculty, we're corporate trainers, and on and on. And we teach in varied modalities. Some of us teach in face-to-face classrooms using more traditional methodologies. Others of us teach in highly blended environments, which is still face-to-face, but you've got multiple stations going on at the same time. Students are teaching students, teachers are working in small groups, students are working in small groups, sometimes they're working independently, all different kinds of variations. You might have hybrid, sometimes called flipped models, and all variations in between. And of course, don't forget something like our own program, 100% online. So the modalities vary substantially. Our content, however, has changed dramatically as well. It's primarily digital. And we don't see, in at least really modern classrooms, we don't see textbooks that much anymore, at least not as we used to think of them. It's more canned content from online developers, or it's content that we develop ourselves and then deliver through a learning management system. And this is the new normal. So if that's the new normal, then what exactly do we as instructors need to know to be successful? Well, you could argue pretty convincingly that teachers need to know and trainers need to know a lot more than just content. And accordingly, I want to introduce to you a framework that's become quite a popular schema to describe what's expected of today's teachers and instructors and trainers. It's called TPACK. And this TPACK stands for technology, pedagogy, and content. And although each knowledge base may seem to appear unique, they're actually closely interrelated. We usually see the TPACK model represented as a Venn diagram that has overlapping areas. And it's a little bit more complex than what I have up here on this slide. You've probably seen it, maybe, something like this. And in this particular diagram, you can see the overlapping areas. Each are critical to represent how there are interactions between each of these different domains. You have technological knowledge, you have pedagogical knowledge, and you have content knowledge, but you also have technological pedagogical knowledge, technological content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, and so on. There are lots of interlaps, and there's this sweet spot right there in the middle, where supposedly all of this is optimized. What does that mean to multimedia developers, and where exactly are we as multimedia developers in this particular model? Well, it's real easy. We're in the blue circle. That's what we do. We're developing content, or in some cases we might be evaluating content, but that's what we do. And so if that's the case, then if the actual learning objects that we either develop ourselves or we evaluate are in that blue section, then what does that really mean? Well, it really means that we need to have a thorough understanding of instructional design. If we're going to develop multimedia learning objects, which is the primary goal of this course, then we need an instructional design model or two to inform how exactly we go about doing that. You've heard of ADDIE before. ADDIE is one of those models, and it's often used in more linear applications where timelines to market are a bit more elongated. Take, for example, a learning object like this video, the video that we're watching right now. I update this typically once a session every time I teach the course, because that's how the course is scheduled. And so I'll analyze exactly what it is content-wise that I think I need to present. I'll then design an outline that kind of sequences everything, and then I'll develop a PowerPoint slideshow. And from that PowerPoint, I'll go into our studio here and I'll record it. It usually takes me several tries to get it right, or at least get it acceptable. And then ultimately I'll export it as an MP4 and then stick it in Moodle. I'll implement it, in other words, in a classroom setting like this. We'll actually use it. And then I'll get feedback. I'll get feedback from you, and then of course I'll evaluate it myself based on that feedback and based on my own understanding of how well I think it actually worked. So this is the more traditional model. Compare that kind of linear development model to one that's more cyclical, iterative. Rapid prototyping is an instructional design model appropriate for learning object development because it requires much more frequent updating. You know, we see variations of this model used anywhere it's critical to make something quickly, and hence the word rapid. And it's with that assumption that the learning object is, never really finished. It just goes through this endless revision cycle that constantly improves the object. We see this used a lot for online learning objects that are not necessarily tied to an academic schedule, especially those that are training resources that are up for just-in-time delivery. Maybe they're up on a website as a link and not necessarily tied to an academic schedule. Here's how it works. You start with an idea, and from that idea you design some type of working prototype, and then you take a look at it. You review it, and you think, well, maybe I want to make some changes, and so you design it over, and from that make another prototype. And keep in mind, a prototype here could be anything from an outline to an actual video. You make something that you can then take a look at and review to try to understand whether or not it's worth continuing. In the next phase, you then ultimately get to a point after several iterations of design work, you decide, all right, I'm going to develop the real thing. And I'm going to go ahead and make this, and I'm going to implement it to my learners, and then I'm going to evaluate whether or not that actually worked. And this is a real common model for software, game, and app development, where products have to go to market sometimes prematurely because of market demand. And inevitably, then there are bugs that get discovered, and they have to be updated, and so new updates are released on an iterative basis. This is really how the professional world works. So ADDIE is a fantastic linear design model, but sometimes you'll see many of the different variations of this rapid prototyping model, but the key distinction here is it's cyclical. You get started quickly, you throw it out there, throw it on the wall, and see if it works, and then make changes to improve it. We keep using this term multimedia learning object, and it might be helpful to officially define it. A multimedia learning object is a digital file that combines a targeted mix of the following elements. You've got text, graphics, photos, videos, narration, sound, music potentially, and even motion. And it can be represented as either a static or a dynamic file. But the most important thing to understand is that it's more granular than a course or a website or an app. It is a standalone file. And when we call it static, it could be something like an illustrated PDF of instructions on how to change a flat tire. When we call it dynamic, an example of a dynamic learning object could be something like this video. It changes over time. The content is sequenced, in other words. So if that's the case, then it's probably worth mentioning that the most important design question that we as developers of multimedia learning objects need to consider is how. If these are the ingredients, then how do we combine them to maximize learning? That is the whole point of this course. It's not just about using cool tools. How do we combine these to make awesome, effective learning objects? And in what combination do we use these elements? Start with an example. It can get really, really complex. Consider something super simple, okay? How to tie shoelaces. All right, have you ever thought about this? Okay, those of you who have been parents obviously have gone through this, but think about it. How effective would it be to teach someone how to tie their shoes using text? Here are the directions. Cross the left and right strings, blah, 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 blah. How effective would that be? Probably not so good. All right, well, what if we added, or if we just used pictures? Would photos of this work better than just text? Well, possibly. A lot depends on the kind of learner you're trying to teach and their background and their prerequisite skill set. What if you combine those? What if you had text and photos? Again, teaching, in this case, a kinesthetic skill versus a conceptual topic. You're teaching them how to actually do something, how to tie their shoelaces. Well, maybe we should combine them. There it is. Knock it out. Go for it, champ. Is that going to work? Well, what if we sequenced it? What if it was no longer static and it becomes dynamic and we reveal this to them time-based progressively? Or maybe they interact with it and they can click on it to advance a slideshow. Step 1, there's the text. Click again, there's the photo. Or maybe they both come up at the same time. What's the difference there? Is one better than the other? Step 2, there's the photo. Step 3, there's the photo. Is that going to work? Well, what if we made it completely dynamic? What if we played a video? For example, now I'm going to have fun with this. Watch this. Those of you who are cocky are thinking, now why is he using tying shoelaces as an example? I'm not an early childhood educator. Now you may not, and your kids may be older right now, but I'm going to bet some money here that many of you are tying your shoelaces the old-fashioned way. Do you know how to tie your shoes really, really quickly? I mean, I'm serious. How many of you can do this, can tie your shoes in 1 second? Watch and learn. Okay, how many elements actually made up that learning object? You saw some video, you heard some music, and you read some text. There's a watermark up there in the right-hand corner where you can see that, say right about here, and this doesn't really have anything else to do with it, but there is some text there. Now my question to you is, was the music distracting or did it actually help? Did it get your attention? Here's another example.
Want to know how to tie shoelace in 2 seconds? You won't believe how simple it is. This is how we do it fast. Now, we're gonna slow down and show you every step. First, tie your laces as usual. Then, put 2 little fingers underneath. Now, your right pointing finger and the thumb goes under the shoelace and left goes over it. Grab the opposite loops at the same time and pull through tight.
Okay, I know some of you are probably tripping over how ridiculously simple it is to tie your shoes this quickly and wondering, well, why have you never done that before? I have to confess I hadn't either, so I learned something watching this as well. But that kind of distracts us away from the real point. The real point is, how are these media elements combined? Okay, in the first video, we had primarily video, music, and some text. In this one, we have video, we have a little bit of music, and then we have narration that's carrying a lot of the message for this particular skill that they're trying to teach. And so my question is, which combination is more effective? Here's another example worth reviewing, a video on long division. In this one, I want you to take a look at the various elements. You'll see animated graphics and you'll hear a synchronized song. But there are some additional design elements that you'll see as well. See if you can spot the use of visual cueing, especially color and motion, to guide the learner's eyes. It's almost like a karaoke framework here. Take a look at this.
Exclusive. This is what you've been waiting for. Better than the best on the planet. Draw a line up to the right. Take the number you're dividing by. Put that number to the left of the line. Now put the number you're dividing with inside of it. Setting up a long division. If you listen, that's the bottom line of it. I try to get this answer to this problem that I'm about to give. 309 divided by 6. Now the 6 won't fit in the 3, but it fits in the 39 6 times.
Okay, so we got some motion and we've got some color cueing there. What do you think? And of course, what was the song? You know, were the learners actively listening because it was so interesting? But were they engaged cognitively? Or does that music create what the researchers call extraneous processing that impedes their ability to actually process the correct or the targeted content, which is obviously the skill of long division? And Mr. Dewey is really famous, and I'm not trying to knock him here because he's got several albums out, and he's made a lot more money probably than any of us. But the question, it's a great example, and the question that's really posing here is, you know, if we're going to take a concept and teach it using some combination of media, what does the research say about how we should combine it? Because clearly not every combination is going to be effective. And that's really the point, figuring out how students learn best from different combinations of multimedia. And that's a really, really complex science. Fortunately, it's been well researched. And in this course, you're going to learn a great deal about specific evidence-based practices that you can implement when you're actually designing your own multimedia learning objects. In general, the research says that the best learning objects use a dual channel design, and we'll explore what this all means later on. But dual channel meaning a visual channel and a verbal channel. And if it also, the best designs also present content on screen at some optimal level of cognitive load. So this is kind of like the Goldilocks syndrome. Not too hot, not too cold, not too much, not too little. There is a sweet spot in there. So we don't overwhelm the learners cognitively. And of course, the learners need to be stimulated for active cognition. They don't just need active behavior. They need to be actively cogitating. They have to be thinking about what's going on here, actively engaged, meaningfully engaged. And the researchers can tell us precisely what that means. Here is the primary framework that's going to explain most of what we study in this course. And these best practices come from Richard Mayer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning. We'll explore this diagram later, but this is one that you'll have to come to a very deep level of understanding throughout the rest of the course. But it's important to know that his research and the research of his colleagues that have followed him, this research has revealed a lot of critical answers to very, very specific design questions that we as multimedia developers need to heed. For example, is a picture worth 1,000 words? Now this is obviously a cliche, but what it's really saying is, can students learn better from a picture than they can from text? Well, maybe if you're tying your shoes, that might be true. But what are the other contexts in which that's true and when it's not true? What about when you compare narration versus text? Again, just like what we saw in those videos, when you have the kinesthetic skills being demonstrated with a narration track, is that better than watching the video with some overlaid text directions and no narration? And what happens if you combine them? What if you have narration and text simultaneously with the video? What if you compare narration versus talking head? In other words, let's say we had a split screen up there and we had an instructor, just their talking head video, maybe it looks something like me, sitting there talking, while in the other side of the screen you have the actual skill being demonstrated. Now, which is going to be better, the talking head split screen version or just the video with the narration? How much content goes on screen? We talked briefly about cognitive load. There is a sweet spot. There is a maximum amount beyond which learners cannot handle. And we need to be very sensitive to that when we design our media. Think about the awful PowerPoints you've seen before that had way too much content on screen and long sentences. And what did the instructor do? They just looked at the slide and they've read the text on there. Awful, awful, awful design. And when we design this, we have to be much more sensitive to what the optimal cognitive load is. And we'll learn that through these best practices. You know, when you put content on screen, there are better places to put content than others. What are the rules that govern where you put stuff on screen? We'll take a look at the CRAP principles as well when we talk about this. Visual cueing. Okay, think back to that karaoke effect. That was a good example. We used motion to cue the learner, and we used color to cue the learner. But there are lots of other kinds of cues as well. Do they even work? Do cues add to engaging a learner and ultimately produce a more effective learning object? We'll find out what the research says about that. How about presenting content together or in sequence? In other words, do you present it simultaneously or in some type of progressive or successive presentation model? Is one method better than the other when you're developing some type of multimedia learning object? The answer is yes. And what about learning object size? Should it be continuous? One great big video, or should we chop it up? Does that even matter, or is it too context dependent? Again, these are all research questions that have been answered, and we're going to learn the answers. Let's switch gears for a moment and identify some of the popular tools that multimedia developers use. And this will be a little bit similar to what we talked about in our orientation video, so we'll go over this real quickly, but just so we're consistent here. This is just a sampling of some of the tools we'll use in the course, and many of these are what the professionals use. Graphics, of course. For developing graphics, there are lots of different tools, Photoshop, Office, Google, and for infographics, there are even some really cool web apps that are out there. Infogram is one, and Easily is another. Video, of course, you know the big players here, Adobe's Creative Cloud Suite, or Premiere Elements. iMovie, if you're an Apple fan, or Final Cut, that's their professional tool. Audio, of course, Audacity and GarageBand. Animation, PowerPoint, Keynote, and of course Prezi. Okay, I totally dismissed Prezi back in the early days. It was a joke, but it's really improved now, and it's worth a second look. More advanced tools, web apps, Animoto, and even Powtoon. Powtoon's come on very strong right now, especially with public school teachers. Very popular animation tool. We don't get to pay too much attention to it in this summer school version of the course, but in later courses we do. Screen capture. Everybody who finishes this course will have a very good skill set using screen capture software. Camtasia is the tool that we're going to use in this course, but Adobe also has one called Captivate, and we don't teach it at Coastal just because of some licensing issues, but Camtasia does virtually everything that Adobe Captivate does. Microsoft Mix. This is a new plugin for PowerPoint, and it's absolutely amazing, and we'll show that to you later in this course. Screencast-O-Matic, ScreenR, and all those other web-based screen capture tools. Those are okay, but you don't have much editing capability like we mentioned early. So we tend to focus on the pro-level tools like Camtasia. And of course, publishing. You know, you make a learning object. What do you do with it? Well, Microsoft Mix can integrate all of those, as can iBooks Author, which you can then publish on iTunes U or elsewhere. InDesign is Adobe's digital publishing tool, very impressive, beyond the scope of this class, but a very impressive platform. And for most of us, we're using some type of HTML5 based course management system, something like Moodle's or any of the other integrated systems that allow you to take your learning object and embed it in a platform that your students can access, and then you can track their performance and so on. Of course, there's a ton of vocabulary you're going to pick up in this course. I'm not going to read through each one of these, but you do need to know that you're responsible for these terms, and they'll be covered in the individual modules. But we'll look at desktop publishing terminology and various terms for graphics, audio, and video, and all of this is critical to understand the lexicon that professional multimedia developers have to use. Finally, let's go ahead and close this lesson with a review of some of the historical predictions made by a few of this country's smartest minds. My question is really simple. Were they correct? Let's find out. Let's start with Thomas Edison, you know, the famous inventor. He invented the phonograph and the motion picture and the light bulb, of course. And he said the motion picture is destined to revolutionize our educational system, and in a few years it will supplant largely, if not entirely, the use of textbooks. How about William Levinson, the famous Cleveland educator? The radio receiver will be as common in the classroom as the blackboard, and radio instruction will be integrated into school life. This was 1945. How about B.F. Skinner? You studied him in your ed psych classes, the famous behavioral learning psychologist. He says, "I was soon saying that with the help of teaching machines and programmed instruction, students could learn twice as much in the same time and with the same effort as in a standard classroom." Wow! So it was the teacher versus the machine, and his prediction was the machine would win. So again, I'm going to ask, were they correct? Well, sort of. I mean, their timelines might have been a little off, but if you look at what's happening in modern progressive classrooms today, you won't see textbooks, you won't see chalkboards, and you probably won't find the teacher at the front of the classroom, but you will see students accessing digital content on a variety of devices and a variety of networked platforms. What does that mean for teachers, and what does it mean for trainers? What does it mean to all of us? Well, it means that knowing how to design multimedia objects so that you can maximize learning is an increasingly critical skill set. And thankfully, there's a wide body of research now that has identified what works and what doesn't. You will finish this course knowing the difference, and you will develop your learning objects accordingly. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you online.